Welcome to the New Masculine podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. I'm so encouraged as I continue to find more and more professionals who are as singularly focused as I am on research and work around men and masculinity. My next guest is the author of Is Masculinity Toxic? A Primer for the 21st Century. This book seeks to evaluate modern masculinity's capacity for good against its potential for destruction, to review evolving definitions of masculinity, and to reveal societal pressures put on men. Dr. Andrew Smiler is a therapist and author, and is the past president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities. On a personal level, Andrew identifies as a father, as a provider, and as a friend. He recently led a TEDx talk titled, What Does It Mean to Be Man Enough?, which I will make sure to link in the show notes. In his therapy practice, he specializes in helping adolescent boys and adult men understand themselves and find better ways to communicate with the important people in their lives. We're very lucky to have him join us on The New Masculine, so let's hear more from him. Thanks for joining me, Andrew.
Thanks for having me, Travis. It's an honor to be here.
It's an honor to have you. I keep finding more and more professionals that are doing this work around men and masculinity, and it just makes me feel so much more excited. I think I came into this work feeling kind of like a man alone talking about this stuff, and to keep finding more and more men that are actively doing the work with me, it just feels really fantastic.
Yeah, I actually had a similar experience when I was in my Ph.D. program. I had at that point taken a graduate level psychology of gender course, which was 14 weeks of learning about women and 1 week of learning about men. But I did not know that there were any psychologists either on the research side or the clinical side who really focused on men or did that research. And I kind of stumbled into a talk on men and masculinity, and that was my introduction to the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities. And about 10 years after that, they made me their president, which was either really lucky for me or crazy or something. But these networks of researchers do exist. The other network here in the U.S. is the American Men's Studies Association. Both groups are kind of small as academic societies go and tend to have a pretty low profile, but the folks are definitely out there and the research is out there for folks who want it.
What was that experience like for you being a president of a society like that that's sort of singularly focused in this way?
It was very exciting and very cool in that way, certainly very kind of gratifying and affirming to have moved from being a student member to being president in about a 10-year span. It did make me question a little bit the fact that I could get there going from student to president in about 10 years. That says something about how small it is. But it was a really neat opportunity. It certainly allowed me to do a lot of networking and meet folks and have excuses to talk to folks that I wouldn't necessarily have had reasons to talk to otherwise. It was also interesting thinking about, as an organization, what kind of image do we want to have and what kind of mark do we want to make on psychology or on the world at large? If you look at undergraduate campuses, psychology departments or gender studies or women's studies departments. Most undergraduate campuses here in the U.S., you can at least get a minor in women's studies or gender studies or something like that. You can certainly always find an introduction to women's studies course. In any given year here in the U.S., only about 100 or 150 universities offer an introduction to men's studies. And I think that there's one institution in the U.S. where you can get a minor. I'm not sure that there's any place where you can major in that. Even in a gender studies department, you're unlikely to be able to focus on men and masculinity. So part of my experience as president was really starting to understand how much work at an organizational level there still is to be done to raise consciousness that this is something we can and should study and something we should teach about.
Yeah. I think that's such an interesting sort of split that happens in the field of psychology. So much of psychology was developed by men, the field of psychology, and yet there's so like the study of masculinity in men is actually quite in its infancy and in early stages of exploration, and really on the shoulders of many women who have been doing gender studies work for so long.
Yeah. I mean, many of the key theorists, and really the underlying idea that we can study gender or gender roles or sex roles, whatever terminology you want to put there, that is very much right out of the feminist canon. It is not something that had really been examined in the Western academic tradition. So there's a way in which all of this work on men's studies relies on that particular underpinning that comes out of feminist theory.
For sure.
But it continually strikes me how few opportunities there are for folks to do academic work on men's studies. So yeah, I think that, when we study just women or just trans folk or queer folk or just gay folk, and we don't study men, particularly straight, cis, white men, we are missing a substantial part of the population, and we end up with a very incomplete understanding of gender and this system known as gender as a result of that. We have very little understanding of what masculinity means to men, to the folks who are expected to perform it. And we know, and I'm sure you and I will discuss this, that a lot of men choose to not really fill that role, to not really meet those expectations. But that is mostly missing from the literature and missing from our understanding.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that people like you and the societies you've belonged to and have led at different times are actively trying to participate in the research around this and exploring this, because there's like that concept that masculinity is sort of like Fight Club. Like we're expected to live in its values, but we don't talk about it, and we don't question it, and we don't challenge it. It just is what it is, and you don't talk about it. So I'm glad there are people talking about it now.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very important. And whether we as men choose to talk about it or not, here in America of 2020, masculinity, and especially toxic masculinity or traditional masculinity, those are certainly part of the cultural conversation. So why then individual men kind of one-on-one like you and I are, or in a small group, even sitting around and having a beer, can't talk about it, kind of doesn't make sense. But, to use a metaphor that the feminists used, it's kind of like a fish talking about water. Like, it's just there. And if you don't have a vocabulary for it, you can't really do it.
Well, and I think that's what I try to seek to do with this podcast, is for anybody that's listening, is to sort of engulf yourself in some vocabulary around this stuff, so that you can start to notice that you are a fish in water, that you are not the water, that you are a fish in the water, that you are a man, you are not masculinity, or you are a masculine identifying person wherever you fall on the gender spectrum. But that doesn't mean that you have to unquestioningly follow the laws of masculinity.
Mm-hmm. And I will say, having listened to several episodes of your podcast now, that is one of the things I really like about it, is this kind of questioning, and also questioning what masculinity is, and providing some education about it.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
You're
I'd
welcome.
I'd love to hear a little bit of like your own personal journey with masculinity. I know you've got a lot of professional experience that I want to tap into in a little bit, but I really want to also know, what are your stories? What did you learn about masculinity growing up, and how has your ideas around masculinity changed over time?
Wow, that's a great question. And I am going to give you what might be the most boring answer you get on this podcast. I think I was a pretty normal, straight, white kid growing up in a middle class community in suburban Philadelphia in the 1970s and 1980s. Um, I was then, and perhaps not a surprise, I was a nerd. Said the guy who later went on to get a Ph.D. It seems kind of like a straight line connection there. And that included playing D&D back in the day on paper, hanging out with a dozen of my buddies all day Saturday. Sometimes we could do a sleepover and continue to play Sunday. I was in the gifted program in my school. Um, and at the same time, and part of this was my dad, and part of this is being in Philadelphia in the 70s. Like, I was a huge sports fan. I am still a fan of the Philadelphia Flyers and Philadelphia Eagles. My dad was a big Phillies fan, and I remember the Phillies winning the World Series in 1980 on my birthday. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow. What a good birthday present.
The birthday present. I was a fan of the 76ers, Dr. J and Moses Malone. It was a good time to be a sports fan in Philadelphia. I got to tell you, like, all four teams were making the playoffs every year through much of my childhood and adolescence. And I think, with the advantage of hindsight, the advantage of some of the education I have, I think that there are a lot of ways in which my interest in sports, even though I didn't play, really, kind of helped balance out my reputation in school as a nerd and as somebody in the gifted program, somebody who was actually chosen for our school's quiz bowl team. So, not only was I a nerd, but I was, way up there.
You rising up the hierarchy of
There
nerdness.
we go. I will also confess that I was our math student of the year, and I have a bachelor's degree in math in addition to my degrees in psychology. So, like, I got some serious nerd cred here.
We're getting a clear picture on who you were and who
yes.
you were your whole life.
And at the same time, like, I was also this huge sports fan. I could talk sports with anybody. And I think in a lot of ways, again, looking back on it, like, that balanced out some of my nerdiness.
Yeah, sports will give you such masculine cred easily in our culture so fast.
Yeah. And so I think there are a lot of ways in which I really did end up as kind of a regular guy. And that was my experience growing up. I could talk sports with anybody. And again, as good as all of those teams were in that era, like, there was a lot of that sports talk. And that helped me, in a lot of ways, connect with other folks. And, there was, unlike many nerds, I didn't have the social problems that we associate with nerdhood that we kind of see exemplified on shows like The Big Bang Theory. There was one kid briefly in 10th or 11th grade who decided that he was going to tease me and pick on me, but it didn't last very long. And in that day, we very much called it teasing, not bullying. As such things go, even by the standards of that era, like, it was not bad. He did not hunt me down after school or on the playground or whatever. And again, it lasted a couple months. Like, I was pretty average in lots of ways. And so compared to other folk stories, the stories I hear from the guys who come to me for therapy, whether they are the victims of bullies or of other horrible things, or whether they are folks who are kind of alpha males and high achieving and CEOs of multi-million-dollar companies, like, my story feels very plain. I think the most exciting thing, so to speak, is that I was a child of divorce in the 70s, which was still pretty uncommon then. If you want to call that exciting or unusual.
I'm kind of excited to hear that there are people that just live a normal life at this point. I think as a life coach, as a ex social worker, like I get to see a lot of people in the moments of struggle in their life, and so
Right.
it's refreshing to hear that there are still just really normal stories out there.
There are. Hopefully, it is not a dying breed. Like, and I will say, as a therapist myself, like I do certainly hear these kinds of stories as well. From some of the adult men, the guys in their 30s and 40s and 50s that I work with, who maybe are struggling because they've been laid off as the economy has shrank, or because they're having marital problems and need help dealing with those issues. But otherwise, a pretty kind of typical childhood.
Yeah, I think those stories for men are only going to increase in frequency and intensity as we're navigating this really intense world that we're in right
Yeah.
now, with the sort of economic collapse, with the coronavirus stuff, with how much division there is in politics, with how much just the landscape is changing all the time. I think those
Hmm.
stories are just getting more and more acute, and I think so glad that there are people like you and me that are focused on supporting men around what their struggles are in life.
Yeah, yeah, me as well. And it is important that there are folks out there who specialize in men, because we know that therapy is seen as an emotion oriented thing, and men are trained to downplay emotion. We know that men, at least men who are fit our cultural expectations of masculinity, um, don't tend to pay as much attention to their emotions as they otherwise might. Don't tend to use the same kind of language around emotions as what folks are taught to expect in therapy school. And so it does take a different ability, or an ability to listen to male clients differently than what folks are trained for in therapy school. And most of the folks who go to therapy school are women. I am a psychologist by training. The data say that anywhere to 70 to 90% of folks who are training to be therapists right now in psychology are female. And if you look at the folks who are male, about 50-50 between straight and gay.
Mm,
A lot of those gay male trainees want to work with gay male clients.
hmm
So it really, really makes for a low percentage of folks, of therapists who are out there who are really familiar with how guys speak and how guys think and how they talk about their feelings. And I think that that's part of the reason that we sometimes talk about men as an underserved population in the world of therapy.
Yeah, that feels so true to me. I teach for a coach training where I teach other coaches how to do the work that I do, and
Hmm.
there's maybe one man in every cohort. I'm the one male instructor. There's maybe one man in every cohort.
Wow.
Often cohorts don't have any men in them. And
Wow.
so in the training process, these female coaches are often learning to coach by coaching each other, using that as the safe space to sort of
Sure.
practice their skill sets. And so they get a lot of practice coaching women. And there's a lot of women in the self help world in general that are interested in that.
Hmm.
And then the one male client shows up. I always I get on my soapbox about, like, oh, we have to talk differently. There are different ways of communicating. There are different barriers to vulnerability and sharing and language skills to describe our emotional world because of how we were raised as boys in this culture. And so I'm always like trying to push to like open the aperture a little bit,
Right.
practice the skill set with a different kind of person who may not have the same emotional literacy or the same psychological safety within themselves to be vulnerable and to share openly what's going on for them, or even know what's going on for them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I'm glad you were able to do that work and there to do it.
Yeah. So, what I keep finding in those of us that are as focused on men and masculinity work is that often we're driven into this field and into this exploration by our own woundings or struggles around it, or failures around masculinity. Like we've had some sort of struggle or
Hmm.
challenge that has led us into why we want to help be a part of changing the current structures of masculinity. Sounds like your normal childhood didn't have a lot of those challenges associated. What is the driving force for you around wanting so passionately to be a part of transforming masculinity or being a part of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, it was a little bit of happenstance and niche finding, if you will. I became a therapist at 23, got my bachelor's degree, went right into a master's program to teach me to be a therapist. And through my 20s, I worked, I was employed by a couple of clinics in the public sector, working with, in child and adolescent units. But my preference was always to work with teenagers because they can explain themselves. And if you give them the opportunity, most of them will at
You're
length.
brave. I worked in child welfare, and I would much rather work with the little kids than I would
and
with the
then, and,
adolescents.
and that tends to be the dynamic.
Yeah.
Most child and adolescent programs, about, I don't know, 2/3, 3/4 of the staff, maybe higher, want to work with younger kids
Yeah.
under 12. And then there's this small number of us that want to work with teenagers. Um, and my experience is that there are very few folks who want to work with both. Like most people seem to have a preference.
Yeah.
And as a therapist, those are definitely different skill sets. But as a male who wanted to work with teenagers, and often working with staffs, where the rest of the staff was female, or the majority of the staff was female, probably 70% of my clients through those 5-6 years that I was working as a therapist were teenage boys. And I liked them and I got along well with them, and people said that I was a good therapist and I did good work with them. And then when I went back to graduate school, because I thought I wanted to teach full time and be a professor, I mentioned I was in this graduate seminar, Psychology of Gender, and we did this 1 week where we talked about boys and men and masculinity. And it really resonated for me. It was like, oh, now I understand a lot more about all of those clients who had been 70-75% of my caseload. And then a year later, stumbling upon this professional society that really focused on boys, men, and masculinity. And so that then shifted the focus of my dissertation into really looking at what are the definitions of masculinity and how do folks learn them. And that guided me through a 10-year kind of research and academic career. I ultimately left academia for a variety of reasons, and I'm back doing therapy. And, coming out of academia after having spent 10 years studying boys and men, and most of my therapeutic experience was with boys and men, it seemed very obvious to me that I should create a therapeutic practice that was focused on serving boys and men, because that was my expertise and I should play to my strengths. So there's a little bit of happenstance in how I got here. There's definitely some interest. There's just some recognizing that there are not a lot of folks who do this. And for my dissertation, I needed to propose research that was new. And so that was a lot easier to do that if I was studying boys and definitions of masculinity than if I was studying, say, boys' condom use or boys' sexual behavior, which is part of where I had wanted to go and is also part of my research. But it was easier to focus on questions around what does it mean to be a man as part of my dissertation, because there's almost no research on that. Whereas there's lots of folks studying condom use and number of sexual partners, because how do we prevent disease and how do we prevent pregnancy have been public health priorities for 70 years now.
Yeah, it's so interesting how you just kind of kept dropping into these spaces, and it just kind of makes a natural, logical logical train right into a career for you.
Yes, there's definitely a piece of luck, and there's a piece of noticing that there are doors there, perhaps opened, perhaps finding some way to open them. I will also share with you, and you may interpret this for whatever it's worth. Until I started working for myself a few years ago, I had never worked for anyone for more than 5 years. Apparently I get somewhat restless or bored or start looking for greener grass or something. I am pleased to say that I have now been working for myself for 7.5 years.
You broke the cycle with
I
yourself.
broke the cycle. I will also tell you that I will also tell you that my boss is a jerk. And he's like, why are you doing this interview? Like, you should be making money. Come on, dude. There's that.
I hear that. Yeah, I have my own boss too. My own internal boss can be quite a jerk sometimes too. I get that.
Absolutely.
So what does your therapy practice look like at this point? Are you mostly working individually in groups, mostly with young boys, with men?
So I work with clients as young as 13. My oldest client at present is in his 50s. I've worked with a few folks older than that. Now that I am in my 50s, working with folks older than that doesn't seem like as much of a stretch as it once did.
Mm-hmm.
In that way of things and perspectives shifting as we get older. Most of my work is one-on-one therapy. It's individual therapy. Although with my teenage clients and even some of my young adults who are college age, there may be family therapy, or we may be doing a combination of individual and family work. I also do some couples work. And for the last year, I've actually run a men's group. So a little bit of everything, which is nice. I get some variety.
And with your men's group that you do, what is the sort of focal point of that group?
So the focal point of that group is we do a lot of work around kind of boundary setting and learning to stand up for yourself. Sometimes we do so what you might think of as assertiveness training. Mm-hmm. We sometimes do some other social skills work. One of the recent conversations we've been having, some of the guys get accused by their wives of being very serious and not being playful enough, or not being playful at all. So we've actually been talking about, like, how do you kind of play with your wife, and how do you joke around with maybe not just the wife, but also people at work or whatever. So there's a piece that you and I might phrase as social skills training. It's also so that is a piece that gives the group structure. But then there's also just time, as with any group, for folks to check in and get support about whatever is going on in their life. And that's something that a lot of the guys that I work with don't have, and they certainly don't have on a regular basis, is a time to sit down with other men and just kind of open up and be relaxed and not have to worry about kind of proving themselves and proving that they're man enough, if they still got it in some ways. Like those status competitions get checked at the door for the hour and a half that we meet every other week.
I think that's one of my favorite things that I've seen in the men's groups that I've led is once men sort of put down the power dynamics and the status, sussing out who's got the most power, who's alpha, who's beta. Once men put that down and it actually starts to get a little vulnerable, watching how much men really crave that kind of intimacy with each other, crave that space to be with each other and share and reflect with each other and be open. So there's so little room for that in our culture given to us. And so there's an initial barrier to actually participating in that. But once that barrier cracks open, there's such a want and a need there for men that I think it's one of my favorite things to witness.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly the guys who have been in my group who have liked it and stayed more than 2 or 3 times say they get a lot out of just that experience. And also that it's one thing to hear it from me as their therapist talking about, there are other guys who do stuff like this or do that or whatever. But then to be sitting in a room with a couple of other guys who are like, oh yeah, I have that problem too. Or, oh yeah, I struggle with this. Or, there's sometimes when my partner is going on and like, I know I should speak up for myself, but it's just not worth it. And then I feel like crap or whatever. No, I don't get what I want. And they talk about being kind of reassured by, hearing other guys who are going through the same thing they are.
Mm-hmm. And so when you're supporting men, what's the kind of major perspective that you take as the professional in that relationship? Like, for example, I tend to come from a bit more of either a feminist perspective or an intersectionality kind of perspective, where it's like looking at, I think me being a gay man in this world, I am both a man and I'm also a part of an underrepresented privileged community, like a
Hmm.
disenfranchised community. And so I'm always looking at how do the intersections of our identities influence each other. But I'm also very passionate about sort of helping men feel a little safer and more comfortable with their feminine energies, with their vulnerability, with their caring emotions, with their weaknesses, with their failures, because that's a personal thing that's important for me
Hmm.
to see in the world and to see in other men. Is there a certain perspective that you take when you are supporting men?
Wow, it's the theoretical orientations question. Um, I, which I have a complicated relationship with.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, by by training and by preference, I'm probably best categorized as an insight therapist.
Mm.
I focus a lot on self-understanding. A lot of my work comes out of research on identity, drawing all the way back to Erik Erikson and his kind of initial Western psychological work on what does identity mean and the values clarification about figuring out who you are and then trying to live a life that is consistent with that understanding of who you are. But I also bring in a lot of social identity um, work as theoretical understanding. So particularly um, uh, Turner's work, and he talks about what does it mean to be a member of an in-group, and how do you get to be a member of an in-group, and what are the pressures that might keep you in a role that you don't want to be in, which certainly starts to butt up with some of
Hmm.
the intersectionality work, and that certainly comes in at times with my work. Um, but I do a lot, so that's where I come from, and from this place of identity and understanding yourself. There's a lot of work as well on what is it you want, or what do you want your life to look like, and how do you get that, and where do you choose to compromise or make sacrifices, and where do you really go for it. Certainly anybody who's in a long-term relationship, whether we call that marriage or dating or whatever, or anybody who has children, or kind of at the most obvious levels, um, those require some amount of compromise or trade-off or back and forth, because we have other people making demands on our energy and our attention and our time, and we can't just do what we want all of the time. And at the same time, if we want to be happy, then we also have to be able to get what we want, which often means asking for what we want, and asking in a way that makes you not a jerk. Because that is an important, because if you ask in a way that makes you a jerk, or where you come across as a jerk, you're probably not going to get it.
Hmm.
Or you might get it in the short term, but not in the long term. So I do a lot of work coming from those paradigms and those concepts. Certainly, there is an intersectional piece, um, what we call it now, but attention to diversity issues
Hmm.
and those particular flavors of how do people fit into the world, and where does the world force them to fit into.
Mm.
And I'll throw a plug here. And I talk about some of this in my TEDx talk. What what does it mean to be man enough? So you can hear me spout off on that for 18 minutes
Oh,
and follow the link.
great. I'm definitely going to link that in the show notes because I'm really encouraged to watch it. I think it's going to be coming out the day after we're recording this. So that's super exciting.
Yeah, yeah. So our the broadcast premiere of the TED Talk is indeed tomorrow, based on our recording, and hopefully before this episode goes live, the TEDx talk will be available on demand. There's apparently a little post production they still need to do.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I'll make sure that that's in the show notes. So, would it be fair to say that your kind of approach is very much an open container that allows your clients to sort of find their own value systems and their own truths and discover skills and tools for how to move forward with those?
Yes, yes, and I'm going to borrow that next time somebody asks me this
It's yours.
question. Thank you.
I'm always fascinated to find like what are the different approaches we're all taking because I know myself well enough to know that I'm a very values driven person, and so inherently my values are always going to be in the work that I'm doing. I do
Hmm.
think it's important to not project onto my clients and to really
Yeah.
let their process be their process and to not force my style on them, But I'm always going to bring in a pretty values-driven way of showing up in the conversation. And so I just
Mhm.
think it's really interesting to see the differences because I think they're all valid and I think they're all important. And the kinds of people that are attracted to work with me are going to be more really values-driven and kind of align with my value system already. It's part
Mhm.
of why I do this podcast is it kind of weeds out any of the kind of clients that might come to me that don't agree with my approach, that don't agree with what
Right.
my value systems are.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
I want to work with people that are already sort of on this sort of intersectionality, diversity, more
Mhm.
feminist approach. Those are the kinds of people I want to work with. And those are the people I feel like I can reach the most. That I'm not going to reach the sort of Christian Trump supporting, like kind of like the very far
Right.
down the other different path than me. We just are too far apart. And
Right.
so I just think it's interesting to kind of look at how we all approach our different work with men.
Yeah, and it always fascinates me to read other therapists' profiles. And if when folks are looking for a therapist, or if one of my clients, their partner wants a therapist or something, well, they'll spend 5 minutes on, okay, I can refer you to some people, but these are the things that I want you to pay attention. Like as you're looking at their websites, what are the metaphors that they use? I will walk down the path with you, or life is a tree, or life is a journey, or whatever. Like, pay attention to what metaphors are there and which metaphors work for you or don't work for you. And really kind of key into that, because that's how they're going to talk.
I think that's so important because so many of us have had not so positive experiences with mental health providers
Hmm.
where we didn't click. And
Yeah.
for men, I think it's even more important to be aware of that as you're sort of assessing whether you want to work with someone, that just because it wasn't the right fit the first time doesn't mean that everybody is the exact same. We all have different approaches and we all show up in different ways with different metaphors and different languaging skills. And to not use that as one more barrier to receiving support from a mental health provider.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think those are great points. And sadly, what part of what the research shows us is that men are less likely to go seek mental health treatment, seek therapy, in general, and even when it's being recommended by a friend or a partner, and even among men who attend therapy or people who go to therapy, men are much more likely to drop out in the
Mhm.
jargon or not return after one or two sessions than are women.
Mm.
So there's definitely a lot of male clients out there who don't aren't willing to take the risk, or they take the risk and the appointment is just okay, and then they decide they're done and they're not going to give a second person a chance, because it's the kind of risk that men aren't trained to take and aren't really prepared for. um, most of us learn that in case of danger, we are expected to run towards it, while we let the women and children run away from it. But and we get that, and you may choose to do that in the moment or not. But the risk of going and talking to someone who is a therapist, who is not involved in your life and doesn't know you from Adam, like, that is a different kind of risk, and that is one the guys are not trained for. And if it doesn't go well the first time, a lot of guys don't go back, and I think that is unfortunate.
It's very unfortunate. I think this might be a really good segue to start talking about your book because I think some of what we learn about masculinity as boys, as men, as we're growing up, is what influences these barriers to us getting the support that we need. So, your book is Masculinity Toxic, a primer for the 21st century. Tell us a little bit about the book.
Sure, and thanks for bringing this up. I will add that I have written several books, and you can find them either in Travis's comments or on my website, andrewsmiler.com, or at your favorite bookseller. But this particular book is Masculinity Toxic, a primer for the 21st century, is published by a British firm, Thames and Hudson, and it is part of their Big Idea series. And so the series is addressing a number of current issues. I think the first books came out in 2017 or 2018. But the titles in the series address issues such as, is gender fluid? Or is democracy working? Will medicine save us? Or something with AI, artificial intelligence, I think is, will AI save us? Should we all be vegetarians? So these are questions that in one way or another, at least in the Western world, folks are grappling with. And we hear lots of discussion in one way or another in everyday culture. The books do have what is for me a very unique style and layout. The books are all relatively short. They're about 144 pages. They are heavily illustrated. There's at least one image on every page. I know there are pages in my book that have 3 pages. And a big shout out to the crew at Thames and Hudson for finding lots of images that make my words really come alive, because I'm horrible at that.
They definitely do make your words come alive.
Yeah. And the text is laid out in a way that folks can, makes it easier to skim. There's text in 3 different font sizes. And while I will tell you that all of the words are important, the ones in the bigger font allow you to effectively kind of skim through the book. Or to just pick it up and read 2 or 3 pages and get some of the gist of that section, and then put it down the way that you might for, say, a coffee table book, although this is not the physical size of a coffee table book.
Yeah, I think that's what you're saying is really, really true about this book. And I think it actually serves as one of the, it's a quick read. It's not while it is rich in what it's offering, it's a quick read, and it doesn't take a lot from you as the reader to invest in this book. And so I think it's actually a really good entry point for a lot of people to explore this masculinity.
Primer for the 21st century. The publisher knew what they were doing here.
And clearly you knew what you were doing too, because you gave a really nice entry point into this world around masculinity.
Thank you. I've had a little practice, both with the masculinity research and from the publisher.
So one of the things that I found most kind of fascinating was in the first chapter of the book, you were talking about some of the cultural shifts we've gone through from the 1800s to the 50s to the 80s. Like, what are some of the cultural shifts that we've had around masculinity over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of times when I do podcasts like this or when I speak in public, this fact that our definition of masculinity, of what it means to be a man, has changed in American history and the history of Western culture. It really seems to catch people by surprise. So if you think about, I'll go back about 150 years. You think about the U.S. in 1870, the country was mostly rural, right? There were relatively few people who lived in big cities. There were a lot of folks who were farmers or lived in these small towns out in the plains, in the rural West. You can visualize that through a lot of these Westerns that we used to watch, that through the 50s and 60s were a central category of movies and TV shows like Bonanza and Wild Wild West. Life was a different pace back then. And, realistically, you kind of knew everyone who lived in your area. We didn't have mandatory schooling yet. That doesn't happen until the beginning of the 1900s. And if you watch those movies and those TV shows, most of the guys really come off as kind of average guys. They're farmers, or they own a shop, or they have some trade. They're a skilled craftsperson, whether that's, they're the iron master, or the woodcrafter, or the baker, or whatever. Boys growing up in that era worked alongside both their parents, their mothers and their fathers, especially if they lived on a farm. And, somewhere starting around age 10, age 12, age 14, they would gradually shift into working primarily with the men as their strength became relevant and as they became strong enough to do that, as their stamina became good enough to do that. But they spent, boys of that era spent a lot of time just in the company of adult men. And it wasn't always their father or their older brothers or their grandfather or their uncles. Sometimes those folks were, ranch hands or farm help or whatever. Or sometimes, a boy with a particular skill at, say, I don't know, baking or working wood, might be spending all of his time with the guys who did that and not with his own father who was out working the fields. And so there was a lot of time for boys and men to talk to each other. They're working side by side for 6, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, day after day after day. Sunday off for church, because this is 1870s America. But the animals still need to be fed, so not entirely off. If you jump forward then, say, 80 years to the 1950s, it's a very different country. The majority of American citizens by the 1950s either lived in large cities, whether that was the actual urban area or whether it was the new and hip suburban areas. Because once upon a time, living in the suburbs was the place to be. That was cool in the 1950s. That was status in the 1950s. By the 1950s, most people, especially people living in cities, had electricity in their house or their apartment. We certainly didn't have that in 1870. A lot of people had one car. You were rich if you had two. We were starting to have mass media. TV, as we know it, really starts in the 1950s. Just for a couple hours a day, though. No DVRs or VCRs. Like, if you want to see the show, you have to be home to see it. And people talked about that, and people would make a point of being home to watch the TV. In that era, as part of this movement towards mass everything in the U.S., most men started working in factories. And so all of a sudden you're working in a place that, say, like the Ford plant, where you basically stand in one position, one spot on a production line, and you do the same thing over and over and over again for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, depending on how far the health and safety and work regulations had gotten and whether or not they were enforced in your neighborhood. But those factory floors were loud as hell. You couldn't talk to anybody. It's kind of like being at a party. Like, you can talk to somebody if you're right next to them, but if they're 3 feet away, forget any conversation. Like, you can yell and that's it. And given the safety standards, the 30s, 40s, even into the 50s and 60s in some places, like, it was not unusual for men who worked in factories to see coworkers, to see friends get severely injured at work. And maybe we stop the production line for 10 or 15 minutes, and then it's usually back to work. Right? That's quite a thing. It's a little hard to imagine that here in 2020, that we wouldn't stop and send in the grief counselors or send everybody home. But that's what they did. Men in that era also had the expectation that if they were working on the production line, they might move up to be a shift supervisor and then a manager and work their way through the ranks. We used to talk in that era of men being at a single employer for 30 or 40 or even 50 years. And loyalty was very much not only rewarded, but expected. And if you watch TV shows from that era, shows like The Honeymooners, you'll see plot lines around somebody having a second job, moonlighting, as it was called. And if your boss at your primary job found out that you had another job, you could be fired for having another job. It didn't matter if you were working for a competitor or not. You could be making pizza instead of working at the factory. You could get fired for that because loyalty was our expectation. And our expectation of men in general was that they were nice guys, that they pitched in and helped out in their community. We expected them to coach Little League, to be in a fraternal organization, such as the Elks, to be an active part of their house of worship. So there was a lot of community then, and community in the 1950s, a lot different than in, say, the 1870s, because the communities were a lot larger. If you jump ahead to 2020, we don't have that same emphasis on physical work, on factory work that we used to. We are in what folks call a knowledge economy or a service economy, where the priorities are your ability to work with your brain and not your hands, and your ability to put on this polite, happy, good service face, and even to help address the client's needs before the client knows what they need. Those are very different skill sets. Today, we don't expect men to be active participants in their community the way that we did in 1950s. In fact, in a lot of ways, the way that masculinity has developed has gone from being these nice stand-up guys in the 1950s who we all pulled together to make the large company, the corporation work. We all pulled together to be the breadbasket of the world. We all pulled together to win the space race, 40,000 people employed in one way or another by NASA trying to put Americans on the moon. And here in 2020, it's all about the individual, right? Be your own brand. You don't need to be loyal to a company. It's okay to change jobs every 2 or 3 years. It's all about how much money you earn. In my understanding of the Bible, very clear that greed is sinful and greed is problematic. And then we hit the go-go 80s, as they were called, and Gordon Gekko, if I remember the name correctly, the main character in Wall Street, teaches us that greed is good. And in the early 2000s, we have Joel Osteen telling us that God wants us to be rich. This is a very different approach to male accomplishment, because this is focused primarily on men, and we see the examples tend to be men. What you do with the rest of your life, what commitments or connections you might have to your community, those really get left out, and they seem to be secondary today in a way that they weren't 70 years ago.
Oh, it's such a really helpful, sort of outline of over time of how things have changed. And I really wanted to pull you out on that because I think there's sometimes an argument that masculinity is just inborn in us and it is just a fact and we can't change it. And yet it has been changing over time based on our external circumstances all the time. I'm really struck by this as you laid out those sort of three distinct eras, that as we move forward in time, there's been less and less, it's been more and more individuation and less and less community driven. Like even in the 1950s, when you're saying like we are a part of our community, but we're also in our jobs and our day to day, most hours of the day that we spend are isolated, alone, independent, individual, can't speak to the people around us. And then there's also this like emotional stoicism that's really taught in those moments of like, if you see your friend injured there, then you have to just move on in 10 minutes and just move on to continue productivity of the work environment. And it seems like there's this association where there's a connection between the further and further we get separated from each other and the way that we individuate and value the individual over the collective, more and more problems around violence, around greed, around more morality issues, like those start to increase the further and further we get separated from each other.
Yeah, I think that's a very real connection, that the more separated we get, the more differentiated or individuated we get, and the less community focused we get, the more we do see other problems, especially problems of violence, or various ways of being nasty to other folks. We know that, one of the ways that political leaders justify all sorts of kind of bad behaviors towards other groups is to make those groups seem less human. There's a reason that that the military deliberately uses nicknames for our enemies. We can go back to World War II and talk about the Jerrys. If you watch a movie like Hotel Rwanda, which gives us it's not quite a documentary, but gives us some real insight into the ethnic cleansing that happened there. The undesirable group were called roaches or cockroaches. Like, we can make people inhuman. And if you already don't know somebody, if you're already separated from them and you don't meet them in places like like church or temple or mosque, or you don't see them in your social organization, and you're not fighting alongside of them, and you're not able to connect to them even at work, how would you know any different? Like, where would you get that experience, especially as an adult once you're out of school?
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me, and I think it extends beyond our own like external relationships with others. It plays out in our relationship to the environment. We're so separated from our food chain, from how
Hmm.
we engage with this planet, from our waste that we put into this planet, from our the way that we're constantly going for natural resources to fuel our lives, and we're not on a sustainable trajectory. The
Right.
way that we are in relationship to the planet, to the relationship we are in with each other, to the relationships we're in with ourselves. I think men's mental health crises are getting bigger and bigger and bigger because we're so separated, because we're unable to have conversations and connect and receive empathy and care.
Yeah, I'm very much with you here, and I think in addition to that separation, what we also see historically is a change in how we think about men's emotional expression. And I'll do a little more history here as well. Um, if we go back to the 1800s and a slightly different moment in the 1800s, we have this group of poets that many of us learned about in middle school or high school, the Romantic era and the Romantic poets. And even if you go back to Shakespeare and all of his flowery language, like most of the famous Romantic poets are male. They have folks like Wadsworth and Lord Byron, and there's about a dozen of them. And I am not an English major, so that's all I got. Um, but if you look at Shakespeare and Shakespearean plays that are set in that era, that are not modernized, see all of this open dialogue by men expressing their feelings, expressing their love for their best male friends, and talking about how they don't know what they would do without those best male friends. And that is part of the era of the day here, or the way the day works back in the 1800s. Um, and then as we come forward, and especially in the early 1900s, as we move into the age of reason and the age of industrialization, we have this, I'm going to call it a choice, about how to redefine masculinity as we enter the new era. And not that that choice is made by a single person. It's kind of a cultural collective choice or movement. What we see is a shift away from that kind of emotionality and emotional expression by men towards a much more stoic and reserved emotional style that allows men to be reasonable, and to be reasonable all the time, not just reasonable at work. And in some ways, we doubled down in the beginning of the 1900s on the idea that men's place is out in the world and women's place is at home. And we center emotionality and connection with others as what women are supposed to do. We center reason and physical labor as what men are supposed to do. And we call these opposites. Now, strictly speaking, they're not. Strictly speaking, you can be smart, good with reason, or you can be dumb. You can be highly emotional, or you can be not very emotional. Those are the true strict opposites. Reason and emotion can very well go together. Today we call that emotional intelligence. And we talk about good salespeople having good emotional intelligence. But that's not the dominant idea in American culture. We often position reason and emotion as opposites. And so for men in the early 1900s, as we enter the era of the age of reason and the age of industrialization, and we move into these mass corporations and mass marketing, men are pushed to be more and more reasonable and less emotional, until we finally get to this place by the end of the 20th century where almost any expression of emotion by men outside of certain situations leaves them open to charges of not being man enough, not being masculine enough.
Yeah, outside of expressions of anger, those that one will
Right.
increase your masculinity, but
Right.
the other ones, no.
Right. You're allowed to do anger. You're allowed to do lust.
Uh huh.
And you're allowed to be really excited or really upset at life cycle events like marriages and births and deaths, or when your team wins or loses the big game. But other than that, like in the day to day, that is not our expectation of men is that they are not emotional, that they are cogs in the machine, to use the 50s expression.
Yeah, there's a quote from your book that I pulled out that sort of encapsulates what we've been talking about. It comes up on page 45, and it's this late 20th century industrial model of masculinity appears to be more explicitly toxic than the 19th century patriarchal model because it specifically supports men's violence, aggression, and risk taking, each of which can cause harm. It also directs men to minimize certain aspects of human functioning, such as an emotional expression and connections with others. Finally, it expressly devalues certain groups of men, including those who are risk-averse, unambitious, or gay. I think that quote just so encapsulates the textures we've been talking about through this, about the challenges of where we're headed as men if we don't start to take a critical look at how we've been operating and where some of it's not our fault. Some of it's the training we've been given. But if we don't start to critically look at the training we've been given and choose, we're operating on models that aren't sustainable and that we're actually not even choosing for ourselves. Like we don't even actually empowered to choose a model for ourselves of how we want to show up as men. We're just playing tapes that have been given to us.
Yeah, and these are tapes that really seem to have been developed in large part in the early 50s and 60s. Certainly some things have changed since then. Male violence has become more acceptable. In the 1950s and the early 60s, we were very worried about juvenile delinquents. And those people who were worried were the people who had fought in World War II and World War I. So they were not, strangers to violence. But, all of these teen boys who were ruffians and not following the rules and all that, they were very concerned about them. So, but, in the 80s, we started to have all of these movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Rambo and all that. And film critics started talking about the body count in movies. And that really kind of marks a change. And we get to make decisions. We talk about men as having the power and having the cultural cachet, and we expect men to kind of be in charge of their lives, and we can change the script, but we do, as you said, need to stop and notice what's there. What are these models that we have been given? And we can make different choices. And one of the things that I ask a lot of my therapy clients is what kind of man do you want to be? And sometimes we make it what kind of person, but most of my clients are male and identify as male. So we just go with what kind of man do you want to be? And I'll routinely have conversations with my clients about, say, Steve Rogers, also known as Captain America, and Tony Stark, also known as Iron Man, or Charlie and Alan from Two and a Half Men. These are characters. The superheroes are in the same universe. The brothers, Charlie and Alan, are in the same universe. But those characters present very differently. And there's clear difference in attitude, certainly in Two and a Half Men. It's clear who the script writers favor and who everything just magically works out for and who is the butt of the jokes. But there's a range of characteristics that differentiate Charlie and Alan, or that differentiate Steve Rogers and Tony Stark, including their willingness to take risk, including their acceptance of violence, including how promiscuous they are, including how nice they are, including how much they genuinely show care for other people. And you can choose which one of those guys you're going to emulate. Or some character from another show. There's nothing particularly special about those folks, except that they're the ones I use a lot.
Well, it's good to have cultural references that we can help model ourselves after and make choices off of.
Yeah, and there are literally millions of examples out there, but and you can look through TV of the era or movies of the era and see what are the versions of maleness, of masculinity, that get repeated often. what are the versions that are making a lot of money or are the top rated shows or top grossing movies? Because that tells you where the culture's at. And, we could argue all day long about which comes first, the movies or the cultural desire. And personally, I think they feed each other. I don't think it's that kind of a straight line. But we do see those kinds of changes in characters, and we see, this broad range of models of masculinity and maleness over time.
Yeah, I think you referred to it in the book as the sort of the man box. It's what I refer to often as
Yeah.
like the narrow lane that masculinity really allows us to travel within. And yet, while we all as men know what that man box is, in our actual lived lives, very few of us are living in that man box and actually live up to that. And so
Yeah.
how do we start giving ourselves permission to live more fully and to choose things that are not within that tight little man box so that we can live more fulfilled lives and not be feel ashamed to bring those aspects of ourselves out so that we can transform this conversation we're having around masculinity.
Yeah. And those are great questions. And I'm going to notice something before I answer that question. The thing I'm going to notice is that we have been talking for all this time now, and we have yet to actually define masculinity.
Mm.
The definition that I tend to use is that masculinity is our culture's expectations for kind of the ideal man or all men. That definition allows it to change. It says that it's whatever the culture wants it to be. And again, as we've discussed here, the culture has changed over the years. And then back to your question. I think in some ways men need permission to change it. I think in some ways they can give themselves that permission or take that permission just of their own. But part of what masculinity is in these days here in 2020 is that it's a competition to see who can fit the stereotype, who can fit the cultural expectations, both well enough and the best. And if you, in theory, what the culture tells you is that the better you fit this image, the stereotype, the more successful you'll be. And whether that's about making money or being famous or having lots of sexual partners, whether or not you actually want lots of sexual partners, that's what the culture tells you, that the more you fit the stereotype, the more of these things that you'll get. Because of course we are also training other folks to respond to this as well. The reality from survey data, from interview across various social sciences is that most guys aren't trying, or they score relatively low. Like the average is, if we say how important is it to you to be tough, or how important is it for you to be promiscuous, like a lot of times if you survey 100 people, like the group average doesn't even meet the middle of the scale. Like, we would score that as, well, the average was a little low. So we get away with that in the professional research. Which tells us that a lot of guys aren't really doing this stuff. But if your masculinity gets challenged, we have trained guys to see that as not kind of living up to expectation, not living up to stereotype. That kind of feels like a failure. And so a lot of guys are stuck in this system that, as you pointed out at the beginning, they don't really understand. We don't really talk about. And so they don't know how to opt out of it, how to say, that's actually not important to me, or I'm not worried about being masculine in those ways, or even tapping into masculinity and its emphasis on being independent and being your own man and saying, I'm my own man and I don't define masculinity in that way. Kind of flips it on its head a little bit and makes people look at you funny. But if you don't know it's there and you don't know how to talk about it, you can't do that and you just kind of feel bad.
Well, I love what you're pointing out right now that I want to put an exclamation point on it, which is just to say, like, so many of us as men were trained to feel like failures in this masculinity game. We aren't really living those values very often, and yet there are moments in our culture where we are expected to perform it. And when we're challenged, we're expected to perform it, but we leave walking away with a sense of failure. I failed. to be that thing that my culture wants me to be. And I think that's an important thing to be aware of, because it speaks to why are more men not standing up and using our privilege and checking our privilege in these sort of cultural conversations around the Me Too movement, around racial injustice, around homophobia, misogyny, any of those things that are coming up for us to look at as a culture, is because so many men are walking around, even though they actually do have privilege, walking around feeling like a failure at the biggest game that most of us are playing most of the time.
And most of this is a game that most of us did not choose to play. Excuse me. It was a game that we were thrust into, whether we want to or not. And again, we are taught that the penalty of failure is huge. It means we will end up without a good job and without a partner and all that, which again is not reality. Most of us have jobs and have partners if we want them. But that's what we were taught, and we don't, because we're not given this language to recognize the rules of the game, or recognize that this is a game, and recognize this is a competition, and a competition where only a few folks can win. We call them, elite, or we call them the top 1% if we're talking about wealth or whatever. Most of us aren't going to get there. Many of us don't try to get there, but who do you tell that you don't want to play the game anymore? Where is that opt out button? Like, I know if I'm playing a game on my computer, I know how to X out and end this.
Where's my unsubscribe from email list?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Where is that button? And because there's no way to let other people know that you have opted out, if you're kind of an average guy, then you're stuck and you're continually forced into this game. There are folks who do opt out, and they tend to have visual markers that make it very clear that they have opted out. If we talk about some of the stereotypes of effeminate gay men, they make it very clear that they are not playing this masculinity game.
Yeah.
If we talk about non-white men here in 2020, there are ways in which they are both forced to play the game, but also prevented from getting too far, too advanced, too many levels up. If we're going to use that, we can talk about discrimination or kind of glass ceilings or whatever. But they don't, they may not get to be the CEO or the CFO, even though they are well qualified. And certainly, the annual list of diversity in, the Fortune 100 or the Fortune 500 or all that really illustrate, how few men of color are able to rise up those ranks. And so, their ability to excel at the game is limited. And there's certainly lots of limitations that get placed that happen in childhood or young adulthood that make it hard for them to really get in the game at all.
Yeah, I think kind of what we're talking about goes back to that first metaphor you used of being a fish in water. Like, get to know the environment you're in, the water that you're swimming in. Don't just take the water for granted, because the water has properties to it that are like the water, being a fish in water requires you to be in water, means you can't leave the water, else you can't breathe.
Right. Requires you to be in plain water or salt water. Requires you to be in water of a certain temperature, water of a certain, dissolved oxygen quality. Thank God I had a client at one point who was really into fish and aquariums. So I have some jargon.
You have a nice metaphor.
I could work that metaphor a little bit.
That's like one of my favorite skills as a provider of coaching work, is to continue building different metaphors based on the person in front of me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think what we're like kind of pointing to, and what my conversations keep leading to, is recognition that we're sort of at a tipping point or a changing point around masculinity. Absolutely. If you're looking ahead to the future and seeing either what you hope to be on the other side or what you think is imperative or necessary to be on the other side of this tipping point, what is one piece of advice you would give to men as they start to look forward?
Wow, that's a big question. Thanks for saving it to the
end. Just a slight little question.
Yeah, no problem.
Just save the world for us, please.
Sure. I think the piece of advice that I will choose to give out here is to really take literally this kind of 1950s, 1960s era injunction to be your own man, to make to give some conscious thought and make some conscious decisions to about this, our cultural expectations of what it means to be a man, or our stereotype or our idealized version of what it means to be a man. Be very conscious and very deliberate and make choices that fit you as best you can. The culture will push back on many of those, whether that's just because we don't like unambitious guys, or because your skin is a color we don't like, or you don't have the ability levels we like, or you are, your sexual orientation makes you different, or whatever. But be your own man and be deliberate about it and give it some thought. Don't just accept this image, this stereotype that American culture feeds us 24/7.
Yeah, give it some thought. I love that. That's what I hope people take away from this is really a willingness to give it some thought, to recognize that these definitions and these ideals have changed over time and they can change again. And you're right, the culture will push against us sometimes. I know that intimately well as a gay man in this world.
Yeah.
And it's okay that it pushes against you. That's part of being your own man. That's part of making your own life and choices, is that you will bump up against resistance. And that doesn't mean that something has gone wrong. That actually might be an indication that you're doing it right.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly if we look at that, all of the equality movements in the US over the last even just 70 years with civil rights and women's rights and gay rights, we see a lot of that resistance. And at the same time, we see that those movements were both opposed by men, particularly the men who um, saw themselves as losing due to, if the status quo were to change, but also supported by men who believed things that, all people are created equal, or, we should treat our neighbors better than ourselves, and we need to take care of each other. Who, signed up and joined the movements and donated money and opened doors that had not previously been open, that had been previously barred and locked. Um, and change is difficult at the cultural level, even at the personal level, and yet change also happens. Um, I grew up in an era when, quote unquote, everybody smoked and nobody wore seatbelts and nobody recycled. I'm 52. It wasn't that long ago. And now, quote unquote, nobody smokes and everybody wears seatbelts and everybody recycles. We see all sorts of cultural change. It can happen here as well, and we can direct it when it comes to masculinity.
Amen. I'm into it.
All right, cool.
So, if people wanted to connect with you beyond just this interview, how might they do that?
Best and easiest contact for me is through my website, www.andrewsmiler.com. You can see a list of the books I've published and the videos I've been in, including my upcoming TEDx talk, as well as getting in touch with me regarding whatever other projects you might be interested in talking to me about, as well as a therapy client.
Yeah, where is your therapy practice in case people are interested in working with you?
So I am based in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and here at the end of 2020, it is almost all teletherapy or virtual therapy. Not so much with the in-person, because I don't have good airflow in my office for that. And the state of North Carolina has occasionally reminded me that my ability to do therapy begins and ends pretty much at the state borders, which is true for most folks who practice therapy.
Yeah.
So, if you're not in North Carolina and you were thinking about connecting with me for therapeutic services, be advised that probably can't happen based on state law.
Yeah. But there are other ways to connect. There's your TEDx talk. There's your books that you've written. What are your other books, the titles of your other books?
So I have two other books that I am continuing to promote in this moment. The first one is Dating and Sex, a guide for the 21st century teen boy, which is pretty much what it sounds like there. It really is a how-to that gives teenage boys, 13 and up, the information they need to know about both of those topics, dating and sex, because most of them will date before they start having sex, and most of them will choose to have sex with people they are dating or want to date. And there's very little information for boys about what it means to be somebody's boyfriend. Girls have places like 17 or Teen Vogue or things like that, or all of these dramas aimed at teen girls that teach them all about relationships and all about trust. And as guys, we get the WWE and Sports Illustrated, and they don't teach us so much about relationships. So that is one of my books that is actually an award winner, several awards. The other book that I am going to promote in this moment is my textbook, which is for an Introduction to Men's Studies course, should you be able to find one or want to teach one. That's called The Masculine Self. It is now in its 6th edition. It is a bestseller in that category. And I'm pleased to write that, and I've taken that over from my friend and colleague, Chris Kilmartin, who worked on that book alone for 20 years and published 4 editions all by himself, which was a huge amount of work when there was not so much research to find, and he really had to dig it out.
So I want to congratulate you on all of the success you've had with your work. And I'm so grateful that people outside of the North Carolina area can also benefit from what you're sharing with the world through your books, through your TEDx talk, and any of the other formats that you choose to continue sharing the work, and here on this podcast.
Yeah, and thank you for having me, Travis. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's been really great to have you. Thank you so much. If you want to get in contact with me, you can go to my Instagram at Travers03. You can also go to my website, travisstock.com, or you can directly email me at travisstock03@gmail.com. I'm also on Patreon, so if you're interested in contributing to the movement that is the New Masculine and helping to support this continued effort around transforming masculinity for more wholeness, consider becoming a patron. The address for that is patreon.com/thenewmasculine. Again, that's patreon.com/thenewmasculine. Thank you so much, Andrew, for your time today and for helping us sort of flesh out the history of masculinity and how we can use that information to really inform where we're going as men. I think that's been a really helpful perspective that you've added to our conversation. So thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And again, thanks for having me.